Hello and welcome. You are listening to an informed take on current events brought to you by law students and staff of Queen's University Belfast. This is LawPod.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this special International Women's Day episode of LawPod, where we are celebrating women who are making positive change in the world through their work in law, human rights and social justice. My name is Rachel Killean and I'm a senior lecturer in the School of Law at Queen's, and I am joined today by our first guest in this series, Professor Anne-Marie McAlinden, also from the School of Law. Anne-Marie is a world-leading expert on the subject of sexual offending against children. Her first book, The Sharing of Sexual Offenders, was awarded the British Society of Criminology Book Prize in 2008. And she has since published books on the topics of grooming and abuse by children and young people. So Anne-Marie, I wonder, just to start us, if you would mind telling us just a little bit more about yourself and your career path and maybe what brought you to academia in the first place.
Sure. Hi, Rachel, and thanks very much for asking me to be part of the podcast today. So I would say, first of all, that I really came to academia probably by accident rather than design. It's not really something I set out or wanted to do. I began by doing a law degree at Queen's, and at that stage I wanted to practice law. But I think through the study of the degree and the subject, I realised that probably wasn't for me. And I also did some work experience, and that really confirmed the fact that I didn't really want to be a solicitor or a barrister. So, and I also knew at that stage that I liked more criminal justice, criminology, criminal law type subjects. And from that, I thought a natural progression to go on to that was to do a master's degree in criminology and criminal justice, which I did at Queen's. As part of that, I knew I started to like researching and writing. So again, a natural progression for that was a PhD. And from that, it just stemmed to that. So from the PhD, from teaching experience, going to conference, I began to think, well, an academic career is for me. So really, it was kind of a process of evolution and design and narrowing of options, I suppose, rather than this is what I wanted to do from the outset. So when I was finishing my PhD then, I went to the University of Ulster for 2 years on a fixed-term contract. First, a lectureship in a teaching-only contract, as it was then called, or education. Then a lectureship in criminology. And then when posts came up at Queen's when I was finishing my PhD, I applied and I've been here ever since.
And you know, it's a particularly sensitive and emotionally difficult kind of topic that you're interested in. And I just wonder what kind of pathway led you to particularly sexual offending against children through that progression that you just outlined?
It's a very good question, Rachel, and it's one I'm always asked. Why sex offending, in particular sex offending against children? As we know, it's one of the most emotive and probably abhorrent topics that there is in terms of research. It's certainly not a dinner party conversation to be had. If you mention what you work on, sort of conversation closes down. But I think I got into it because it's, first of all, it's topical and interesting. I've always been interested more broadly in crime and criminality. When I was doing my undergraduate law dissertation, one of the big cases at the time was that of Julia Somerville, who was then a newsreader. And she took photographs of her child in the bath, which a Boots optician reported her to the police for because they thought it was potentially an indecent image. So from that case then, I did my undergraduate dissertation paper on child pornography legislation. As I say, leading on to the Masters in Queen's, the new legislation governing sex offender registration and community notification, known as Megan's Law, was just out in the US. That was the end of the 90s. So that was a progression into that, again, sort of broadly in the area of sex offences against children. It was a topical area. And then finally from my PhD, that stemmed on then to looking at those similar issues: pornography, management of sex offenders, registration in the context of Northern Ireland. So I think it stemmed out of a broader interest in crime and criminality. But why I went to that particular area is, I think, in a range of topical issues and cases that seem to be ongoing. And I think that's really still the case. Unfortunately, it's an area, there are many different areas to it, historical abuse, online aspects, but unfortunately it's a topic that's not going to go away. There's always something new to write about.
And I think what's really interesting about your work as well, and the story of how you got into it actually makes a lot of sense, is that you're not a kind of pearl clutching, moralistic type researcher. You know, you've got this kind of critical lens that you bring to the offending, but also our responses to offending as a society, and in terms of the legal and policy responses that we adopt in terms of this kind of offending. And I wonder, what has been the most surprising finding that's come out of your research?
I think probably, Rachel, one of the most surprising findings was in relation to grooming. So you mentioned some of the books I've done. I did a book on grooming a number of years ago. And when I started that grooming project, obviously you start like any project looking at the literature by some of the biggest names actually in the area of sex offending, academics and practitioners. The literature says that grooming is ubiquitous in sexual offending against children. In other words, you can't have abuse without grooming. But when I actually started to do the field work, so it was multi-jurisdictional field work in Scotland, Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and England and Wales. When I looked at those jurisdictions and interviewed professionals within that, actually the field work turned my initial understanding of grooming on its head. So, in other words, what emerged was grooming, particularly within families, is much, much more complex and multi-layered. So, for instance, if a person wants to groom a child who they already know, they don't have to get over any hurdles because they're already there, they already have a relationship. So there may not, in other words, be grooming before the first offence. So the fact that grooming operates in different contexts and different layers was very interesting to me, and that really was against the bulk of the existing literature at the time. So that was the contribution that work made. But again, as I said there, it was surprising in that I didn't expect to find that. It went against probably decades of knowledge on this. So that just shows you, I suppose, how, what real sort of field work can do. It can actually inform perceptions and inform literature and actually challenge paradigms.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And, you mentioned field work there. I mean, I can't even really, I research genocide, but I can't really imagine the particular challenges that come from trying to conduct this kind of field work. And I wonder if you could just reflect on that process of actually conducting this kind of work and this kind of topic.
Sure, and I think probably it's fair to say there are both challenges for the research in general, doing that type of work, particularly field work, and then challenges for you personally as a researcher. So in relation to the first one, some of the challenges and things to keep in mind, the difficulties you have to negotiate, are things like obviously avoiding the re-traumatisation of victims or survivors. So this is particularly acute, for example, at the moment with all the different inquiries and forms of transitional justice going on in relation to historical institutional abuse survivors. There's a risk with child abuse victims or HIA victims, there's a risk that you can sort of over-research populations and ask similar questions, and that risks re-traumatising victims. So you need to think, can you do this research another way without actually looking at victims or survivors? Can you look at professional viewpoints, for example? I think another difficulty generally in terms of the research you've mentioned there, and thank you for that I treated, I don't go down the moral sensationalism route. It's quite critical and it's detached, but I hope sensitive approach to the work. It's difficult to trade that line because, it is an emotive and sensitive topic. You have to try and write in a neutral way to avoid sensationalist language, even though it's an issue that causes concern and impacts indeed on many people. So that's a difficulty in terms also of how you might engage with maybe public audiences, what media outlets you might use. Sort of following on from that in terms of, the difficulties for the researchers themselves, again, just to do with that traumatic subject matter. I think, for example, I remember once when I was doing the fieldwork for the grooming book in Birmingham and coming out of a police station in Birmingham after doing an interview with a couple of police officers. Now, again, I wasn't actually sitting there listening to the perspectives of survivors and first-hand accounts. This was through the prism or the eyes of police officers. But what they were relaying to me in terms of the dynamics of offending within family situations, so fathers grooming children and maybe, steps and stirs of children within a family at the same time, is absolutely horrific stuff. So that's a real difficulty in this area. I think it's not always acknowledged. And I think to try and, mitigate against that, it does impact, and it's important to debrief and have self-care and protect yourself, whatever way that works for you, your hobbies or talking to others, and certainly those particular difficulties I've found more acute as I've had children, because obviously you can relate and you think, what if this were my children? So I think there's a balance to be had there. You want to try and be sensitive to the work, but at the same time not overly desensitized that you don't care enough about the issues you're dealing with. So that's a difficulty there, I think, because of the emotive nature of the subject.
Yeah, and you mentioned having children there, and none of us can ever be truly objective. We always just carry our identities around with us. Did you notice a kind of shift in the way you were thinking about your work once you became a parent yourself?
Not as such, Rachel, in terms of the approach I generally took, but I think just what I've mentioned there, I think reading cases just hit much closer to home in terms of, yes, on the one hand, it's good to be detached, but it makes you realise these are real people, real families, real children. So I think just the immediacy, the importance of the work and the potential impact and the care that needs to be taken here sort of drives home to you more.
Yeah, that's an important point, actually. Thank you. And it leads me to what I actually wanted to talk about next, which is, this is a really crucial area of work. It needs urgent attention, and you've been good at engaging with policy and seeing your work as something that can make an impact in the real world as well as in academia. So I wondered whether you might be able to reflect a little bit on that, because one of the themes of this podcast is people working to bring about positive change, and that's maybe not something we always associate with academics, or maybe not what a member of the public would associate with academics. So I wonder if you could just reflect on how academics can use their work to bring about positive change in relation to social justice issues.
Well, I think there are lots of possibilities here, Rachel. I mean, I know it's the bywords of universities now in terms of engaged research, it's dissemination and leading to impact and all of that. But it's also very worthwhile from a personal perspective outside the institutional sort of imperatives. And there are lots of possibilities here. So, the possibilities stem from, I think, building connections and networks with people. And you can do that, for example, from the very start of your research by trying to build in public engagement and dissemination from the outset of your work. But what that really means then is, to try and think about the research design from the very start, conceptualization of the research in terms of who will actually be the professionals or end users or beneficiaries of this. And that might mean, for example, showing your research instrument to professionals to make sure you have the right language that's used. So I know in my own work, for example, we're now moving to a situation where the terminology of sex offender isn't even acceptable because it's about labelling. So instead you try and use person first language, such as individuals convicted of sexual offending. Now, some people might think that's too politically correct, but I suppose it's just about being sensitive, having the right language and framework. And I think that public engagement can help that. And that's how you think you get your work to have one of the most positive influences, is thinking about those kind of end goals from the start of the research. I think other ways to do it include things like trying to attend professional conferences as well as academic conferences, trying to write for a range of audiences. So while we all have pressures as academics to do your all singing, all dancing, big journal articles or big books, I think it's important to try and write for a range of audiences, whether that means for professional journals, for newspapers, doing things like blogs, conversation pieces, the QPOL, the Queen's Policy Series. I think in some ways the opportunities to try and affect social justice and change and bring about positive impact from your work gets easier as you get further established in your career, because it stands to sense as you become more well known, people ask you to do more things. But there are some very positive examples of our early career researchers doing this as well, so I think we can all do it. The other thing I would say is that it's very much a two-way process, so it's not just about us giving and disseminating and sharing our knowledge with professionals or communities. We can also learn from that the other way around. And certainly my own research has been very much informed by networking with professionals and through different pieces of work I've done, field work and consultancy, for example, I've built up a good range of contacts. So that two-way process is important. And just finally, I suppose, on the limitations of this, again, I'll go back to what I said about the media and the subject matter. If you're working in a particularly sensitive area of work like sex offending, you need to choose your dissemination outlets very, very carefully. So, you know, you need to think carefully before you go on radio or certain television programs. And again, to make sure, you know, you keep your integrity and handle the area with sensitivity, because, for example, a survivor could be listening to you. So again, it's about that sort of balance in terms of sensitivity to the work, even if you're doing outreach or trying to affect change.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I can see how that becomes all the more important in the kind of areas that you work in. So you've done a couple of quite high profile, I suppose, kind of engagement with impact driven activities. And I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about them, if that's possible. So you have engaged in external consultancy for the Northern Ireland office on issues around public attitudes to sexual offending and employment opportunities for sexual offenders. I wonder, did that experience reflect some of those possibilities and limitations that you were just highlighting for us?
Yes, so both of those projects, Rachel, were, as you've mentioned, in conjunction with the Northern Ireland office, now the Department of Justice, and the Public Protection Arrangements Northern Ireland, which is our multi-agency framework, so police, probation, etc., for managing and risk assessing sex offenders. So they asked me to do both of those projects. In the first case, the public attitude study, there were, as an external company actually did the public survey with 1,000 members of the Northern Ireland public. I actually analysed the data and wrote up the report based on the literature. And the second one, as you've mentioned, was on employment opportunities. I did that one from scratch, sort of a critical literature review, looking at comparative research at what other jurisdictions were doing in terms of employment opportunities or barriers to reintegration and employment for sex offenders. And both of those I found very positive. And from those, I've built trust and relationships with key people, both within the statutory sector and voluntary sector. So both were very worthwhile. Obviously, there's a level of trust there that has to go on. They don't know you at the start. They know you by reputation. So they're trusting that you will do a good job and handle the data, you know, sensitively and confidentially and all of that. But I find that very, very positive. And other things have arisen from that, because one, you know, again, the snowballing thing and the idea of when you become more established, people ask you to do things. Other things have flown from those two opportunities, like keynotes and things. The other one I did more recently was the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse in Australia, and that was in March 2017. So the Royal Commission asked me initially to review a research report of theirs on grooming, which I did. Then they asked me to give some evidence as part of their panel hearings on grooming and entrapment. So I prepared notes for commission lawyers on the basics of grooming, and then I give live evidence. So that was very worthwhile as well. Time consuming, but worthwhile. That has actually led to the basis of one of our REF impact case studies for this year. So what I would say is, in terms of reflecting on that, if you get the opportunity, do it. I think most universities are the same, allow so many days consultancy per year. It is time consuming, but worthwhile in terms of allowing you to build up a network of professional contacts. But on the downside, as I say, apart from the time consuming being able to actually do the work, which leads to impact, it's also time consuming in terms of following up and trying to keep track of it. So, for example, for the REF impact case study, quite a lot of work had to go into tracking the media and tracking what different organisations have done with your research. So it's definitely something to think about. It's an avenue into public engagement and dissemination, and it can broaden your professional contacts, as I've said.
And it sounds like in those incidences, it was quite a positive experience in terms of your ability to influence change. Do you experience pushback, you know, in light of the kind of critical and nuanced perspective you take on what, as you've said, is quite an alarming topic? Or have you found that actually in practice your experiences are more positive?
I think probably I've been very lucky, Rachel. I've never actually had any pushback. Actually, once only, and that was as a PhD student, which was unfortunate because that's the stage where you need support and are maybe not as confident in taking pushback or negative criticism. That was the case where I was at a conference as a PhD student speaking about using restorative justice to combat domestic violence or forms of sexualised and gendered violence, and there was a reaction from a judge in the audience who basically said, you know, this is just crazy stuff, trying to use this, all the traditional arguments about restorative justice, the arguments against it, that, you know, it disempowers victims, it's re-traumatisation, there's no accountability of perpetrators, all of that. So I was lucky in that that's the only experience that I've had, even though some of the work I've done, like the first book you've mentioned, The Shaming of Sex Offenders, advocated for restorative justice for offenders. That's a hard message for communities to hear, perhaps even a hard message for some survivors to hear if they want prosecution or punishment. But I think overall I've been lucky, and I hope that I've handled the work sensitively and made the arguments reasonably and evidence-based, that people have accepted that.
Yeah, and that's also just a tribute to the kind of professionalism and sensitivity that you bring to the topic, I'm sure, as well. Anne-Marie, so part of most of this podcast is about, your work and how you've brought about change and all that kind of thing. But it's also, this is about International Women's Day and the role of women in different areas of work and women who are bringing about change. And I don't want to fall into that kind of cliche, like, what do you think as a woman? But I wonder, as you've progressed through your career, what your thoughts are in terms of the barriers that remain for women in academia, if there are still barriers, and what could be improved in that regard.
I guess that's the important question, Rachel. I think that's obviously, as you've said, one of the reasons why we're here today. Well, I've been in academia about 20 years, and I think it's fair to say things definitely have improved. So we have things like, obviously, the Swan agenda, our Bronze Award within the school, and, the particular development of things like family-friendly policies, core working hours, all of that. We also have more broadly in the university the Queen's Gender Initiative. So I think all of those and an awareness of gender has definitely helped. In other words, it's something that it's okay to talk about and say, this affects me differently, or I have a possible issue with this, that it's acceptable to do that. So, for example, I remember at the very start of my career as a lecturer, I just joined Queen's, and I had a particular issue with I wasn't the only one, but I was the only one that voiced it, with teaching in the evenings. Master's classes at that stage were 5:30 to 8:30. And I completely understand why they were. It was to facilitate part-time students who were working, which is fair enough on one level. But I was proud of myself in the sense that I stood up as a female lecturer and said, this is not really great in terms of asking people to teach all day. I then had to get to Newry with children, all of that. So other people followed in behind, and that policy was actually changed. So I think at that time I was maybe afraid to say it, but did say it. Can we look at this, please? Is it possible to move this? But I think it's more acceptable to say that now. So in terms of barriers, I think one of the stemming from that, probably a barrier that still exists for women, is confidence. And this is not being gendered in any way, but I know from my experience of promotion panels and grant applications and mentoring people that sometimes, and not to be gendered or generous, but sometimes women can have less confidence than their male counterparts in terms of going for things. So applying for promotion when you think you're ready, rather than waiting, for example, till you've ticked every single box on the form, or, having the confidence to go for a bigger grant. I think we could do more around that. And I think one of the answers to that is more of this more formalised lean-in culture, as they say, a bit more tailored mentoring. Mentoring is something I've been very interested in, and I'm trying to develop a scheme at the moment with Professor Louise Mander, the current Swan champion. I think mentoring is the key here, to listen to other women's experiences and to get advice. Now, not everybody, I think the difficulty is not everybody is supportive. Most people are, and I think we work in a supportive law school. Academia is very competitive as well, which I think makes it difficult. So not everybody will be on your side in terms of saying, yes, this is the best for you. But there are plenty of people willing to help. So I think in terms of improving, make use of your supportive contacts, those who are willing to help you. I think, for example, my dad used to say to me, I don't know if this is actually true or not, but my dad used to say, and I've heard other people actually say this too, that you have to be twice as good as a man to succeed. I don't know if that's actually the case. I think it comes down again, as I said a moment ago, about confidence, that have confidence in your own abilities, seek support, and go for things at the right time. Don't wait.
Yeah, I mean, that rings very true to me. In times where I'm feeling insecure, I always kind of repeat to myself, that you should embody the confidence of a white man,
Absolutely.
And I think that remains true to some extent. Yeah. I liked what you were saying there about, it's also about listening to others, women's experiences and their advice. And I suppose just to kind of finish off our conversation then, it might be nice if you could share any you've already been quite generous in sharing advice and tips and things, but do you have any final pieces of advice for perhaps a young woman who's considering an academic career?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing to say, Rachel, is it's hard work. It's not sociable hours sometimes. Sometimes you can, change your day around if you have other things on and personal commitments or family commitments on. But quite often it's long hours. If you have deadlines or you have marking or whatever, research deadlines or marking, it can be quite long hours. But I think it's a very, very enjoyable and worthwhile career. I think what I would say is that, again, take the advice and support. I think first and foremost, though, is to say that I always believe, and I've always worked this way myself, that I think the ultimate responsibility for your career is you. No one's going to hand it to you on a plate. But I think there's plenty of people who will help and support you, read your work and mentor and provide advice about promotion, when's the time to go and all of that. So do reach out and take that advice and support. I think for anybody starting off or thinking about it, I think, make the most of those opportunities. I think networking is important. I think we're, at a stage in universities and academic life where interdisciplinarity is becoming increasingly important. So we can no longer just work siloed and work on our own within the school. It's important to work and look at what others are doing outside the school, across the university, and indeed outside the university. I think early in your career, it's important to go to conferences. I've mentioned already the professional as well as academic conferences. I know some of the people I met at the British Society of Criminology conference, for example, as a PhD student, I've kept in contact with. They're both now professors. I think also another bit of advice is, to try and get a balance in a number of senses. Balance in terms of, actually having a life. You could spend your life working at evenings and weekends just to be on top of things, to get your research done. Have a balance in terms of it's your job. It should just be your job. It's not your life, even though as much as I enjoy it. I think also it's trying to get a balance as well in terms of teaching and research. So at times you might have a heavier teaching load. Certainly when you're starting off, you have more teaching in terms of prep to do if you're new to a subject area. But it's important to find that time for writing. And that's probably one of the key things is to work out, and it comes after a while, to work out what is right for you in terms of getting that time for writing. I used to get advice from people, senior people, when I started off to say, you must write every day. Personally, I can't work like that. I need a block of time to get in at least an afternoon. I can't work an hour here, an hour there. But find a time that's right for you. But you must have a balance with teaching and research and keep the writing going, because I think it's like anything, it's a skill. You have to practice it. So I think in a nutshell, it's hard work, but I would say go for it. It's a good job. It's a very enjoyable job, and no 2 days are the same.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. And I have to say, even though I'm not, I guess, emerging anymore, I found that reminder of those kinds of pieces of advice really helpful as I was listening to you. So thank you very much. And thank you so much for giving us your time. I really appreciate you coming and talking to LawPod.
You're welcome. Thank you very much, Rachel, for asking me. I was really happy to do it and be asked. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you. So you have been listening to LawPod, which is an informed take on current events brought to you by the law students and staff here at Queen's University, Belfast. This episode was produced by Dr Lauren Dempster. Our theme music is by Colonel Chocolate and the Justice Triangle, and we are funded by Queen's University Law School. Many thanks again to Professor Anne-Marie McAlinden for joining us for this International Women's Day special. Please follow us. We're on Twitter at QUB LawPod, and for more information for our episodes, you can visit our website lawpod.org. We'll have show notes where you can learn more information about the topics covered today, and you can find us on iTunes or anywhere you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening. I am Rachel Killean, and this was LawPod.